Hello everyone, welcome to my channel SW Metro official channel.
Meri and Robyn go head-to-head in a clash that has been building for years, an emotional collision of personalities, histories, loyalties, and frustrations that finally reaches a boiling point while Kody stands by, paralyzed by his inability to manage the conflict or even fully understand where his responsibilities lie. And as the confrontation unfolds, it becomes clear that this is not just a simple disagreement between two women who happen to share a past with the same man, but rather a reflection of deeper fractures within the Brown family legacy, a war of narratives and values that touches on themes of betrayal, favoritism, loyalty, and survival. And while Meri comes into the moment armed with years of silent suffering and suppressed resentment about the way she has been sidelined, Robyn is equally ready to defend herself, framing her position as one of sacrifice and misunderstood devotion, creating a situation in which every sentence they speak lands like a sharp blow and every glance reveals volumes of backstory that the cameras may never fully capture. And yet the most fascinating part is not simply what is said but what remains unsaid, because Meri's voice carries the echoes of her early sacrifices, her role as the first wife who once envisioned herself as the cornerstone of Kody's plural marriage, the matriarch who believed she would guide the family into a united future, while Robyn's tone conveys the weight of years spent being branded the favorite, the interloper, the one who supposedly ruined everything, and yet in her own mind she has been carrying burdens that no one else seemed willing to shoulder, stepping into a fractured family and trying to hold it together even as everyone around her accused her of tearing it apart. So when these two opposing forces finally stand face to face, the air is charged with decades of tension, accusations of manipulation, whispered rumors, and unhealed wounds, and Kody, who once fancied himself a leader capable of balancing multiple relationships with wisdom and fairness, suddenly looks like a man trapped in the crossfire of two storms he cannot control, a man whose bravado and patriarchal authority have crumbled under the sheer force of his wife's evolving identities and demands for recognition, respect, and truth. And while Meri accuses Robyn of having monopolized not just Kody's time but his loyalty, his trust, and ultimately his heart, Robyn counters with the argument that she never asked to be placed on a pedestal, that Kody's choices are his own, and that if the family disintegrated it is not because she stole him away but because the foundation was cracked long before she arrived, which leads to a spiraling back and forth in which each woman insists she has been unfairly maligned, each bringing receipts in the form of memories, overlooked contributions, and painful sacrifices. And the intensity of the moment grows so raw that even the production crew feels the weight of what they are capturing, aware that history is being rewritten before their very eyes. And in the midst of this emotional tempest, Kody paces, stammers, and shakes his head, alternately trying to interject and falling silent, a man who once thrived on attention now unable to command even a sliver of it, because the narrative is no longer his to dictate. And while he may desperately want to diffuse the situation with his usual mixture of indignation and self-pity, he realizes that anything he says could either validate one woman and further alienate the other or expose his own culpability in ways he cannot bear to admit. So he says almost nothing, letting the fire burn, letting the battle unfold, and in doing so confirming to both Meri and Robyn that he has lost control, that the emperor has no clothes, that the patriarch has become a spectator in his own family drama. And this realization pushes the conflict to an even more volatile place, because Meri, emboldened by the awareness that Kody is no longer the authority she once feared disappointing, lets loose years of pent-up truth, describing how she felt invisible, discarded, and betrayed, not only by Kody but by the narrative Robyn seemed to encourage, in which Meri was always on the outside, always a problem, always the one who could never quite fit in, and Robyn, fighting back tears but refusing to back down, insists that she never wanted to exclude Meri, that she extended invitations, offered friendship, tried to be a sister wife, only to be rebuffed and accused of ulterior motives. So why should she now be cast as the villain for Kody's failure to balance his relationships? And as their voices rise, Kody mutters that he doesn't know what to do, repeating it like a mantra, his hands gesturing wildly, his face flushed with confusion and frustration. And the tragic irony is that he is right, he truly does not know what to do, because to take a side would be to destroy whatever fragile connection remains with the other. And to remain neutral is to reveal his weakness, his inability to live up to the image of the strong, guiding husband he once portrayed himself to be. So he paces, he sighs, he rubs his temples, and still the battle rages, Meri and Robyn circling each other like opponents in a verbal boxing ring, each jab reopening old wounds, each defensive parry revealing new insecurities, until the audience watching at home realizes that what they are seeing is not just reality television drama but a microcosm of failed communication, shifting gender dynamics, and the collapse of a man's carefully constructed identity as husband, father, and leader. And as the episode ends, the screen fades on Kody whispering again that he doesn't know what to do, his voice small, broken, and uncertain, and for the first time in years, the women no longer look to him for guidance but stare past him, recognizing that their lives, their choices, and their futures will be decided not by Kody Brown's decrees, but by their own strength, resilience, and willingness to face the truth of what has been lost and what must come next. And this shift in power, though terrifying, is also liberating, a reminder that even in the wreckage of a collapsing plural marriage, the women can still claim their voices, their dignity, and their right to define their own stories, with or without the man who once claimed to be their leader. Meri and Robyn were not mourners but rival high priestesses presiding over the desecrated altar. Their long-simmering Cold War, conducted for years in whispered grievances, strategic sidelong glances, and carefully deployed tears, had finally, inevitably, reached its thermonuclear climax. And at the epicenter of the blast, frantically trying to plug leaks in a submarine already crushed by the pressure of his own failings, stood Kody Brown, a self-proclaimed patriarch reduced to a hollowed-out, wild-eyed spectator in the ruin of his own making. He didn't know what to do because, for the first time, he was confronted with a problem his ego, his bluster, and his flimsy set of patriarchal principles could not solve. This was not a rebellion he could quash, it was a fundamental recalibration of power, and he was utterly obsolete. For over a decade, the dynamic had been a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare, with Robyn wielding her perceived victimhood in Kody's favor like a scalpel, expertly dissecting Meri standing in the family. Meri, the legal wife, the first wife, had been systematically isolated, her loyalty weaponized against her until it became her only defining trait. She was the barnacle clinging to the rusted hull of the SS Principal, long after the ship had sunk. Robyn, by contrast, was the gleaming new flagship, harboring the captain in her warm, obedient quarters. Their conflict was never a fair fight, it was a siege, and Meri had long ago run out of supplies. But a cornered animal, even a weary one, is at its most dangerous, and the COVID-19 pandemic provided the final, airtight cage that forced the confrontation. Kody's draconian, ever-shifting rules were not just about a virus, they were the ultimate litmus test of compliance, a loyalty oath written in sanitizer and solitude. And in wielding them, he handed Robyn the ultimate veto power over all other relationships, a power she exercised not with malice, but with the serene, infuriating certainty of the chosen one. The head-to-head battle, when it finally erupted, was not a shouting match. It was something far more devastating, a quiet, brutal excavation of truth. It was Meri, her voice trembling with a lifetime of suppressed rage and hurt, finally vocalizing the unspeakable, that Robyn was not the innocent peacemaker but the chief beneficiary of a broken system. It was her pointing out the absurdity of the rules, the blatant hypocrisy of Robyn's children, the tenders of the tender-aged, being granted access while others, including Meri herself, were treated as biohazards. It was her asking the simple, lethal question that Kody had spent years avoiding: why is her compliance the benchmark for my worth? And facing this, Robyn did not fight with logic, she weaponized her emotion. Her tears were not a sign of weakness but a tactical retreat into a fortress of perceived persecution. Each sob was a reinforcement of her narrative. She was trying to save the family, she was the one advocating for unity, she was the victim of Meri's bitterness and Christine's jealousy. She didn't defend the rules, she defended her fragile heart, making any critique of the rules an attack on her very being. It was a defense so perfectly engineered to appeal to Kody's savior complex that it was practically airtight. And Kody? Kody was lost. One could almost see the gears in his head, stripped and sparking, grinding to a complete halt. This was his nightmare scenario. This was the moment the two women he had, in his own twisted way, relied upon most, one for her dogged, inexplicable loyalty, the other for her sycophantic validation, turned their pain directly toward him and demanded a verdict. He was the judge, but the case was against his own judiciary. To side with Meri was to admit that his beloved Robyn, the architect of his domestic peace, was complicit in the family's fracture. It was to invalidate the entire worldview he had built around Robyn's perfection. It was to admit his COVID rules were not about safety but about control and favoritism. But to side with Robyn was to finally, formally, and irrevocably drive the final nail into the coffin containing his marriage to Meri, a move he was emotionally ready for but perhaps not prepared to be held accountable for on camera, in the stark light of day. He was trapped in the cognitive dissonance of his own creation. His usual tactics, deflection, anger, rewriting history, failed him. He could not blame Meri's attitude or Christine's influence because the math was too simple, the hypocrisy too glaring. He sputtered. He stared into the middle distance, a man desperately searching for an escape hatch that wasn't there. He offered platitudes about following the rules that sounded even to his own ears as hollow as a rotten gourd. He was a king whose two most steadfast generals had suddenly turned and asked him to choose which kingdom to save, revealing there had only ever been one kingdom to begin with, and he was its only citizen. This head-to-head confrontation was the death rattle of the Brown family as it was once purported to be. It was significant not because it changed anything, the fates of these relationships were already sealed, but because it forced the truth into the open air, where it could no longer be suffocated by denial. It proved that the core conflict was never really Meri versus Robyn, it was always Kody's failure of leadership versus the reality of his toxic favoritism. The two wives were merely the opposing poles of his catastrophic moral failure. In that frozen Flagstaff great room, Meri was finally fighting for the dignity of her own exit, and Robyn was fighting to preserve the ecosystem of privilege that depended on her status as the perpetual victim. Kody, however, wasn't fighting for anything at all. He was a spectator, paralyzed, watching the consequences of a decade of neglect and poor decisions manifest in the two women sitting on his wife's expensive couches. He didn't know what to do because there was nothing to do. The damage was terminal. The only thing left was to watch the end, and in his stunned, helpless silence, he finally gave the only honest performance of his life, a man completely and utterly defeated by the monstrous creation of his own ego.